was a software development engineer on the payments team at a subscription media company. I mainly worked on APIs and transaction processing. When we introduced annual plans in Brazil, customer support started reporting successful payments followed by subscriptions being cancelled several days later. At first I treated it as an ordinary retry problem. I added logging around our payment callbacks and found that the cancellations followed a local payment method called boleto, where authorization and settlement happen at different times. I realized I understood card payments well, but not asynchronous settlement, expiry rules, reconciliation, or the regulatory messages our provider sent. That gap meant I could write code, but I couldn't judge whether our state model was correct. The issue affected about 1,900 attempted subscriptions a week. Roughly 8% entered a contradictory state, and agents were manually comparing provider records with our database. My objective was to build enough subject matter expertise to define the correct lifecycle, reduce contradictory states below 1%, and give support and explanation they could use with customers. I started by mapping what I knew and what I didn't. I could explain our internal events, but not which provider event represented authorization, cash receipt, expiry, reversal, or final settlement. I wrote those unknowns as questions rather than pretending they were implementation details. I read the provider's integration and reconciliation guides, then built a small state transition table from every event type. Documentation alone wasn't enough because several events could arrive out of order. I booked sessions with our finance reconciliation analyst and a Portuguese-speaking support lead. Finance showed me how settled funds appeared in the daily ledger. Support showed me customer messages that revealed where our terminology was misleading. I also asked an engineer at the payment provider to walk through 5 anonymized failure traces. That exposed my main wrong assumption. I thought an expiry event meant the payment had failed. In fact, cash could be received near the deadline and settlement could arrive after expiry. Our service immediately cancelled on expiry and ignored the later settlement because the subscription was already terminal. To make the learning concrete, I replayed 3 months of provider events into a local model and compared its final state with the finance ledger. I tried 2 designs. One used more conditional handlers around the existing terminal states. The other separated the customer's subscription intent from the payment instrument settlement state. The second design was slightly more work, but it represented uncertainty directly and made late settlement recoverable, so I chose it. I wrote a design review that explained the domain in plain language, including the evidence behind each transition. A senior engineer challenged whether we needed a new state or could simply delay expiry by 24 hours. I tested that alternative against the replay data. It reduced errors but still failed for weekends and regional holidays, so the evidence supported the explicit pending settlement state. My first implementation still had a flaw. I keyed reconciliation by our checkout reference, but a customer could generate a second reference after retrying. During shadow processing, that produced duplicate candidate matches. I went back to finance, learned how the provider's bank reference remained stable, and changed the join while adding an ambiguity queue instead of guessing. We ran the new lifecycle in shadow for 10 days, covering just over 27,000 events. It matched the finance ledger in 99.4% of cases. The remainder were all routed to the ambiguity queue with enough evidence for manual resolution. After rollout, contradictory subscription states fell from about 8% to 0.6%. Manual comparisons dropped from roughly 15 staff hours a week to under 2, and support's repeat contacts on this issue fell by 18%. I shared the state guide and replay harness with 2 other payment teams, and I ran a walkthrough so they could challenge it rather than simply accept my conclusions. What I would do differently is involve the reconciliation analyst before reading deeply on my own. The documentation gave me vocabulary, but the ledger showed which distinctions actually mattered. Since then, when I enter an unfamiliar domain, I pair source material with an expert's real operating evidence from the start.